Corporate megastores are spending millions lobbying DC politicians on one-sided policies that send small businesses tumbling. They want to enact harmful credit card mandates that take resources away from your local credit union and community bank, leaving Main Street businesses with less access to credit, making it harder for your family to pay for everyday goods like gas and groceries. Tell Congress to guard your card and oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card mandates.
Paid for by Electronic Payments Coalition.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Canada's economy is sliding dramatically.
Canada's economic struggles will ease next year.
It's a tough time right now in this economy, in the jobs market. If you're young and looking for work, the youth unemployment rate this summer has been up to nearly 15%. It's the highest in years. You have to go back to recessionary times, the last time it was that high, of course, outside the pandemic. But the job market for other age groups really hasn't been all that bad. So why is it that it's so tough for the kids today to find work? Well, a study by economists at Desjardins Financial takes a look at the root causes and some possible solutions. Hello, my name is Mike Eppel, and this is In This Economy. Joining me on the line is one of the co-authors of the Desjardins report, economist LJ Valencia. Hello there, LJ. Thanks for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to chatting about what's going on with youth unemployment today.
It certainly has been frustrating. I'm sure for many young people out there who this summer, maybe they were out of university or college or even in high school trying to find a job and just running into roadblock after roadblock. So can we kind of go back to where your study kind of found where the change happened, I suppose, in the youth labor market? And really, it looks like it was occurring during the pandemic and what businesses at that point were clamoring to find, and that was young employees.
That's correct. I mean, it's a lot of interesting things have happened over the past, I suppose, few years following the end of the pandemic. So obviously, when the pandemic happened, there's this huge shock that hit the Canadian economy. And coming out of it, there's a significant labor shortage that needed to be met. And part of that's also contributing to higher wages at the time. And so there was a lot of clamoring, increased demand and clamoring for more workers in the economy. And that's sort of part of that's been reflected in the recent immigration policies at the time from the federal government. And we've seen an unprecedented rise, or not necessarily unprecedented, but it's quite a large increase of immigration in the country to reflect the country's labor demand. And a lot of the newcomers that have come to the country also happen to correspond to much younger segments of the population. So that's people aged 15 to 24. And so now we've come to this point, right, when over the past few years, and you've mentioned this as well, that youth unemployment hasn't really been just a one-time trend. It's been happening for the past 3 years since the end of the pandemic. And that's really been a reflection partly of this increased inflow of new workers into the economy, and also slowing economic activity as well. Do we have this sort of two compounding factors that are playing in the overall youth unemployment numbers that we've been seeing so far today?
Yeah, and your study does point out, though, that really when we look at the term youth unemployment, that's a fairly wide-ranging age group. Disproportionately, it's the youngest cohort that's really been hit here, right? The 15 to 19-year-olds.
Yeah, no, that's correct. I mean, what's interesting as well in that sort of development is that we're not just seeing a rise in unemployment, but we're also been seeing some decline in what economists would call the labor force participation of workers age 15 to 19. So that's the teen, as you've said, the teen component of the workforce. And what that really means is that, a lot of teenagers who would have been looking for jobs decided to stop looking for work. And so they've quote unquote left the labor force. And so we've been seeing a decline in the labor force participation rate for that segment of the labor force, but we're still seeing the unemployment rate increase. And so what that really tells us is that while we're seeing a steady sort of decrease in people looking for work, especially in that age cohort, there's also been a decrease in job opportunities in general, right? And so that's been reflected as well through the higher unemployment rate that we've observed so far.
Well, to that point, has there been a societal or structural change in the workforce? You say there aren't as many jobs for teenagers, really. I mean, I know back in the day, I hate, let's use that term. When I was growing up, there were lots of jobs on farms. That's what we did in the summertime. I grew up on a farm. I worked at the farm. But that job that I had then no longer exists because farming, for example, is heavily mechanized. So you don't have those types of summertime jobs even in existence anymore. Has I guess the pool of work availability, it's just kind of dried up a little bit.
Yeah, that's totally correct. So there's one of the interesting findings that we've seen in our studies, that the youth unemployment rate in general is very sensitive to the changes in the economy. So whenever, say, for example, economic activity slows down, oftentimes youth unemployment is the first thing that increases, and youth in general are hit the hardest when say, for example, when in a period of a recession, or in general, if like economic activity sort of grinds to a halt. Now, what's also interesting as well is that we've seen, there's a survey that nearly 1 in 5 of teens, though, so that's folks age 15 to 19 years old, would like to work but really can't find a job. And so that's honestly quite reflective of some of the observations as well that you've mentioned, in that there's a lot of teenagers who would like to work, but there's just isn't as many opportunities out there. Now, what's also compounding this sort of what you've mentioned, a structural component to this, is that we're also, the Canadian economy in general is undergoing a significant structural shift that's coming from the tariff situation that we're seeing south of the border and the trade tensions with the United States. And so because of that sort of situation placing a damp on the Canadian economy in general, that also compounds the job market for youth, more so than, say, core age workers, so that's folks age 25 to 54. And so those are really some important sort of structural components I think that really needs to be kept in mind and really needs to be discussed further, especially when looking at the context of youth unemployment in general.
You think the way that people find jobs today also plays into this, in as much as you'll see a retailer or a restaurant chain, they put up these job postings, but instead of printing out a resume, going into that location, talking to the manager face to face, you have to go through the website, which is really impersonal. And the other end, it's just, and I don't even know if a human's reading it on the other end, or if it's just being scanned and saying nope, 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 and you don't even get a shot to get your foot in the door and gain that experience.
Yeah, I think that's another. Thank you for raising that. That's actually another sort of important structural aspect to this, because I mean, we're talking about the future of our labor force right here, right? I mean, this is people age 15 to 24. They're the ones who are going to become at some point the core age workers of our economy, right? And so sort of having unemployment, there's also work that's been done by one of my colleagues as well in Desjardins economics, in that unemployment early in a career can have lasting impacts on, and that can have knock-on effects on your future career development, especially if you're a youth, right? At your earnings potential could be hampered or could be detrimentally affected by early period of unemployment. And so there is definitely that sort of structural aspects as well. Now you try to contextualize that with what's going on recently as well. I mean, while if you look at the labor numbers, like wages have sort of kept up at the pace of inflation, but that doesn't sort of address, or that doesn't also account for the fact that while youth are in general work in much lower, like, average wage professions, they also have to deal with much higher costs, such as increased rent and food, which hasn't really changed drastically. And we've seen significant rises in those sort of essential categories, right? I mean, people need to pay rent, people need to pay food, right? People need to feed themselves. And if you're a youth and facing this sort of difficult prospect, I mean, yeah, that can definitely have some permanent, like long-lasting impacts on one's career for sure.
How do you gain experience if you can't get that first job, so to speak, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
100% for sure.
It certainly is frustrating, to say the very least. I was thinking about this, about how government plays a role in this, and in a lot of cases, the summertime employment specifically, is municipal jobs, maybe provincially backed jobs, summer work programs or what have you. Are those are those in existence? Have those been cut back? Because we have heard, of course, about various levels of government running deficits, and they're looking for austerity measures. And, has that had a spillover effect?
For sure. I mean, what I can definitely speak to is that there's an interesting chart in our piece that looked at what's been happening so far. Say, for example, this is pertaining mostly to the federal public service, mainly to the federal public service. Now, what's been happening since the public service has undertaken significant job cuts, quote unquote, is that we've seen a significant decline in employment that's heavily concentrated towards people aged 20 to 29. And so roughly half of that the folks that are affected in that category corresponds to the youth, right? So I guess if you contextualize the sort of what's happening recently with federal public service cuts, I mean, youth are definitely disproportionately impacted by what's happening in the public sector. Now, that said, there are existing programs in place, such as the Youth Employment and Skills Strategy, and programs that fall under there, such as the Canada Summer Jobs Program. And so these programs are still in place, and there's roughly a funding commitment, I think, of around $400 million for that program over the 2024 to 2028 period. And so there are existing, I suppose, supports in place, but I suppose that does leave room for conversation on sort of what sort of things. There are more things are needed to be done in sort of that aspect, because you're right, we're facing times of economic difficulties, and governments are potentially facing budget constraints left, right, and center, right, and choices must be made. But this is also, but that said, this is an important component, an important issue in our economy that needs to be addressed, and so I think it's important for governments to at least work towards coordinating various sort of efforts to at least help stem the tide of rising youth unemployment in the economy.
Yeah. Well, look, like the influx of temporary foreign workers, I mean, that was obviously, huge for a time. The feds have started to rein that back in, but that doesn't solve the problem overnight, does it? That's a structural thing that's going to have to take its time, because those folks who came in when they were needed, so to speak, they're still here, and they're not, they're also competing for the same job. So that's, is there a guesstimate, so to speak, how many years this could take to kind of filter through the system?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, it's thank you for raising that as well. So what we've done a recent piece at the beginning of the year, looking at how the federal government's new non-permanent resident and permanent resident targets are going to impact population levels moving forward. And what we've found is that the government is pretty far from achieving, or relatively far from achieving, its supposed 5% share of non-permanent residents as a portion of the population. So with that in mind, it's a little bit, I suppose, the federal government remains far from achieving its sort of immigration targets. And you're right, a lot of these people are still here in Canada, and it will take some time as well for either people to leave or to see much more reduced immigration levels. I mean, we're already seeing that in the numbers as well. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the new total number of new NPRs that has entered the country has declined by around 34% year on year, and that's pretty significant, mind you. What the government sort of, I guess if you look at the projections as well, what that would imply is that we need to have people leaving the country for them to get close to their targets, and we're not really close from getting there. So yeah, I think that's really a good way to, I suppose, contextualize one, the immigration policies that the government has in place and how that could affect, not just the population growth, but also, I guess it, mind you, like I do want to say as well that while the government is far from reaching its population targets, these new sort of immigration policies are, should provide some offset as well, to this sort of increased supply of new workers in the economy. So while obviously the government's far from reaching its targets, that doesn't mean that it wouldn't make a difference in helping soften, I suppose, the rising tide of youth unemployment in the country. So
yeah, well, have businesses, have they missed an opportunity here? I mean, they were saying we don't have enough workers, and yet, no, I have a feeling that there were a lot of younger people who were probably, more than able and willing to work, but maybe they just didn't have that connection. Like, again, getting back to the whole idea of how people are hired today. Is this, maybe a strategic opportunity for small business to actually, find a very credible and able-bodied workforce, again, at a relatively low cost when you're talking entry level, but maybe to help improve the situation.
Yeah, for sure. That's an interesting question because we are in I don't want to repeat the word unprecedented, but we are in unusual times, right? What's unusual as well is that there's been this increased sort of adoption, say, or increased push towards the adoption, say, for example, of artificial intelligence and increased automation, and that's also been sort of, I suppose, playing some role as well in how workers, or like, say, for example, firms are hiring like new workers in the economy. There's actually a recent study in the United States that found that while experienced workers in AI exposed occupations generally that hasn't seen sort of significant employment losses, or maybe even saw increased employment, early career workers, so that's folks aged 22 to 25, have experienced notable job losses. While we haven't really seen that sort of play out necessarily in Canada, there could be some sort of, there's disruptions that come from that could affect firms' hiring intentions. And so I think that's also one thing to keep in mind as well when contextualizing, say, for example, like business hiring decisions, and in relation to, say, for example, youth in our economy.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too, and your study points this out, if you can't find a job, what's the next best option? Well, stay in school or take another course or what have you. And maybe that comes back to what you should be studying in school, that is sort of AI proof, if you will, or works in conjunction with new technologies. And again, to upskill your educational background to find the jobs that are available.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's what's also, I guess, one thing I forgot to mention as well is that there has been a growing sort of role. So say, for example, there's been this growing sort of share of like contract and gig work among youth workers in our economy. And one thing I suppose that's been a barrier as well, say, for example, because we've talked about what's been happening in teenagers in our economy, is that there are minimum wage requirements that bar most teams from qualifying for this type of work. That, again, not just necessarily relates to, I suppose, firm hiring intentions, but also just the fact that opportunities are very few then this time around, especially if, say, for example, if you're youth and you're trying to find gig work, it's kind of like you can't even qualify for that type of work, right? So that's also one thing as well that I think that's pretty important to keep in mind, especially when thinking about declining employment opportunities for youth.
Yeah, that's right. The age restrictions. You go to some of these apps, and if you're under 18, you're not eligible right there to do to even apply for certain jobs.
Absolutely, that's right.
And is there also competition coming from, like, let's face it. There are a lot of people, who may be retired, let's say, but they need, a little extra cash just to make ends meet because of inflation and everything else that's gone on. Again, structurally speaking in the economy, are they coming back to some of these jobs that maybe initially would have been filled by simply, just the younger age cohort, in some cases, some retirees filling them?
It's hard to say with the current numbers, but what we can definitely say for certainty is that the pool of work is getting smaller, and has been decreasing. So our pool of available job opportunities has been decreasing in general over the past, I suppose, few months recently, especially more so now. That said, it's that really highlights, for example, like if you're a new you're a youth like entering the workforce, right? You don't have a lot of experience. You're competing with maybe folks who have already have long-standing experience, or like more tenured workers in the economy that can easily outcompete you. So I guess that sort of in that aspect, there's sort of competition factors that how do I say this, sort of compound or at least make it difficult for new workers, new entrants in our economy to find jobs, right?
I guess at the end of the day, though, I mean, this does still, we're talking about, as we mentioned off the top, the youngest of the youth in the labor market. They're struggling the most, and they're still in school. So does that require then the education system to work more closely with employers who would be looking for those entry level jobs to just to bridge that gap?
For sure. I mean, it's I'll say for experience. I mean, when I did my undergraduate at the University of Alberta, there were existing sort of employment programs in place to like help students, undergraduate students, help build their resume, help sort of find, help build their networks, maybe do like a sort of mentorship program opportunities. And so I suppose like these programs that are existing programs in place are even more so crucial, right? In terms of bridging, the future of our workforce into, and helping them integrate into the workforce later on in their careers. So, I mean, that's, yeah, for sure, 100%. And that speaks to the gravity and importance of these programs even more. And I personally speaking from my experience, I think that also helped me a lot with, establishing a lot of the sort of skills that I have skills that I need to be able to navigate through the job market. And I don't think I'd be able to say necessarily, work and not get to where I am, partly because of this, partly because of what I've learned through these existing programs at my university at the time. So,
it sounds
100%
like,
for sure.
Need more of that. Thank you very much for joining me today, LJ.
Oh yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me.
It's good talking to you. Important topic.
Thank you.
And that was economist LJ Valencia from Desjardins Financial. Thanks for listening to In This Economy. You can send me feedback on this or any other episode by emailing me at mike.eppel, that's EPPEL, at rci.rogers.com. You can leave us a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can always find us on the Seeker app or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Please rate, review, follow, and share. My name is Mike Eppel. Thanks for listening.